The day my son demanded that I pay his wife's mortgage, something inside me finally cracked. And I don't mean loudly. It was a quiet break, the kind that happens when you realize the person standing in front of you is no longer who you raised. I remember gripping the steering wheel afterward, sitting in my driveway long after the engine died, staring at my own front door like it belonged to someone else. I had spent my entire life believing that if I did my job right as a father, respect would come naturally, that love didn't come with invoices, that family didn't keep score. I was wrong. My name is Richard Hale, and I'm a retired construction project manager who worked 40 years without shortcuts, without scandals, without handouts. I raised my son with the same values: earn your place, protect your word, stand on your own feet. Or at least, I thought I did. That afternoon, he sat across from me at my kitchen table, arms crossed, jaw tight, and spoke like he was negotiating with a stranger. He didn't ask if I could help. He told me I would. When I said no, calmly, respectfully, he didn't argue. He smiled. And that smile told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. To understand why his demand hit so hard, you have to understand what I already gave. I paid for his college tuition when scholarships ran out. I co-signed his first car loan when his credit was thin. I let him move back home twice, once after graduation, once after his first marriage collapsed under its own weight. I never kept receipts, never reminded him of sacrifices, because that's not how I was raised. My father believed help was something you gave quietly, and pride was something you carried alone. When my son married again, I attended the wedding, wrote a generous check, and stayed politely out of the way. His wife never liked me much. She smiled with her mouth, not her eyes. She asked questions about my savings that felt too sharp to be curiosity. Still, I minded my business. When they bought a house far above their means, I said nothing. When they renovated instead of saving, I said nothing. I assumed adulthood would eventually arrive on its own. Then came the call. He said they were under pressure. He said interest rates changed. He said family steps up when things get hard. That's when I realized this wasn't about emergency, it was about expectation. They didn't want help, they wanted obligation. And when I refused to become their backup plan, his voice hardened in a way I'd never heard before. That was the first moment I sensed this would not end quietly. I told him no because the numbers didn't make sense, and because the principle mattered more than the money. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable. Comfortable enough to retire without fear, to live without debt, to sleep without panic. I wasn't about to trade that peace so two grown adults could avoid consequences they created. I explained this slowly, carefully, like I used to when he was a teenager asking for car keys past curfew. I expected frustration. I expected disappointment. I didn't expect anger. He accused me of choosing money over family. He said I owed him for everything he went through growing up. That's when I understood the story he'd been telling himself, the version where I was a provider, not a parent, a resource, not a man. I stood up, told him the conversation was over, and walked him to the door. He didn't look back when he left. 2 days later, a courier knocked on my door and handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a lawsuit demanding $600,000, claiming I had promised financial support, that I had encouraged reliance, that my refusal caused emotional and financial damage. I sat down hard in my hallway chair and stared at my own name printed under the word defendant. That's when fear finally arrived. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as silence. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't eat. I just sat at my dining table, rereading the document until the words blurred together. My son wasn't just suing me, he was rewriting our entire history. According to those pages, I was controlling, manipulative, financially coercive. The father I recognized was nowhere in that story. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the certainty that this version of events had been rehearsed long before I ever said no. You don't file a lawsuit like that on impulse. This had been planned. That realization changed something in me. I stopped seeing my son as emotional. I started seeing him as strategic. And strategy requires response, not reaction. The next morning, I called an attorney recommended by an old colleague, someone known for calm, surgical thinking. When he finished reading the complaint, he looked at me and said, "This isn't about winning money. This is about leverage." He explained how lawsuits can be used to intimidate, to exhaust, to force settlements from people who just want peace. Then he asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Do you want this to be over quickly, or do you want the truth on record?" I didn't answer right away, but deep down I knew. If I folded now, this would never end. Preparing for court felt like preparing for a funeral. Quiet, methodical, heavy with finality. I gathered bank statements, old emails, text messages, and handwritten notes I didn't even remember keeping. My attorney told me something that surprised me. Consistency matters more than emotion. Judges don't care how betrayed you feel. They care whether the story holds up when pressure is applied. And pressure was coming. My son stopped speaking to me entirely. His wife sent messages dripping with false politeness, hinting at family solutions if I'd just reconsider. I didn't respond. Silence became my shield. Every unanswered message strengthened my position. Meanwhile, I learned how deep their claims went. They alleged I'd verbally promised to ensure housing stability. That phrase kept me awake at night. I'd never said those words, but someone had. I wondered who. That question haunted me until discovery began. When documents were exchanged, something unexpected surfaced. A series of texts between my son and his wife discussing how to phrase it so Dad feels cornered. Reading those lines felt like swallowing ice, but it also gave me clarity. This wasn't desperation, it was entitlement dressed as necessity. And entitlement doesn't survive scrutiny. For the first time since the lawsuit arrived, I slept through the night. I knew the truth had weight, and soon it would have witnesses. The first court date wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no gasps, just a room full of strangers and one familiar face that refused to meet my eyes. My son looked smaller in that courtroom, not physically, but morally. When the judge asked preliminary questions, my attorney answered calmly, precisely. Their attorney spoke faster, louder, leaning heavily on emotion. I watched carefully. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a performance, and performances crack under cross-examination. When the judge scheduled depositions, I felt a shift. This was no longer a threat, it was a test. During my deposition, I told the truth plainly. I admitted to helping in the past. I denied promises I never made. I explained my values without apology. When it was my son's turn, something interesting happened. He contradicted himself. Dates didn't line up, phrases changed, and when asked why no written agreement existed, he blamed trust. That answer didn't land the way he hoped. Outside the courthouse, his wife finally looked nervous. That was the moment I realized they hadn't expected resistance. They expected guilt, and guilt was the one thing I refused to carry. As weeks turned into months, the pressure flipped. Their legal bills grew. Mine stayed controlled. I stopped feeling defensive and started feeling observant. I noticed how my son avoided specifics, how his anger flared when facts were questioned. I wasn't angry anymore. I was disappointed, but focused. One evening, my attorney called with an update that made me sit down. The opposing side was considering settlement, not because they were confident, but because discovery was exposing more than they intended. They wanted me to pay a fraction and make it go away. I thought about it, thought about holidays, thought about blood. Then I said no again, not out of spite, but out of principle. Some lessons cost money, others cost pride. I was done paying for theirs. The trial date was set, and for the first time, I felt ready. The night before trial, I walked through my house slowly, touching familiar things, door frames, picture frames, the worn arm of my favorite chair. I realized something then. Regardless of the outcome, I had already reclaimed something important: my dignity. I wasn't fighting to punish my son. I was fighting to define the truth. In the morning, I put on a suit I hadn't worn in years and drove myself to court. No witnesses, no supporters, just me. When testimony began, the judge listened carefully. When contradictions surfaced, they lingered in the room like smoke. And when the key question finally came, whether any proof existed of my obligation, the silence was loud. My son stared at the table. His wife squeezed his hand too late. The truth doesn't rush. It waits. The verdict didn't come immediately. Judges rarely reward impatience. But when it did, it was clear. The claims were dismissed. Not reduced, not negotiated, dismissed. The judge cited lack of evidence and misuse of the court system. I felt relief, but not triumph. My son didn't look at me as they left. His wife did, and in her eyes I saw calculation give way to consequence. Outside the courthouse, reporters didn't wait. This wasn't news, it was personal, and that made it heavier. Weeks later, my phone buzzed with a message from my son. Just 6 words. I didn't think it would go this far. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned the phone face down. Some distances can't be undone with apology. I didn't block him. I didn't reply. I chose peace. And that choice, quiet, firm, final, was the real victory. But the consequences of that lawsuit weren't finished yet. The days after the dismissal were strangely quiet, like the calm after a storm you didn't realize had been tearing through your life until it stopped. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years started calling, not to gossip, but to check in. Word travels faster than truth, but truth has a longer shelf life. I learned that my son and his wife had been telling people I cut them off and abandoned them financially. The lawsuit had been their proof, until it wasn't. Now the same people who nodded along were asking uncomfortable questions. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself. Silence, I'd learned, lets lies collapse under their own weight. One afternoon, my attorney forwarded me a message from their side requesting a private conversation, no lawyers present. I declined. Boundaries don't loosen just because someone regrets crossing them. That decision cost me emotionally. There were moments I replayed memories of my son as a boy, baseball games, scraped knees, late-night talks. I wondered where I missed the turn. But reflection isn't the same as surrender. I could grieve the relationship without reopening the wound. That realization steadied me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that consequences rarely end with court orders. They ripple outward, and I had a sense those ripples were just starting to reach them. About a month later, I ran into an old coworker at the hardware store. He asked carefully how I was holding up. When I said I was fine, he nodded and said something unexpected. "You did the right thing. People are talking." Not in a scandalous way, but in a clarifying one. Apparently, my son's workplace had caught wind of the lawsuit. Employers don't like unpredictability, especially when it involves family finances and legal aggression. His wife's job, too, had raised concerns. They had presented themselves as victims. The paper trail said otherwise. I didn't celebrate this. I didn't need to. Consequences don't require applause. They require distance. That night, I received a voicemail from my son, longer this time. He sounded tired, not angry. He said the stress had gotten out of hand, that things were spiraling. He asked if we could talk. I listened to the message twice, then I saved it and didn't respond. I wasn't punishing him. I was protecting myself. The version of him who sued me hadn't disappeared. It had just gone quiet. And quiet doesn't always mean safe. When people hear about lawsuits between family members, they assume the worst moment is the courtroom. They're wrong. The worst moment comes later, when you realize you've been recast as a character in someone else's narrative. I discovered that my son had told relatives I forced his hand, that I left him no choice. That framing fascinated me. Choice disappears only when accountability appears. I attended a family gathering for the first time since the trial, fully expecting tension. What I didn't expect was hesitation. People didn't know how to treat me. Some avoided eye contact, others were overly warm. I let it be awkward. Awkwardness is honest. Eventually, an aunt pulled me aside and said, "We didn't know the whole story." I told her she didn't need to. That was the moment I realized I had stopped needing validation. My peace no longer depended on being understood by everyone. That's a dangerous freedom for people who rely on control, and my son had relied on it for too long. The real shift came when the house went on the market. Not mine, theirs. I noticed it by accident while browsing listings one evening. Same photos, same inflated language, motivated sellers. That phrase tells you everything. I felt a twinge of sadness, then relief. They had built their life on assumptions about income, about support, about me. Assumptions are brittle foundations. When they called again, this time together, I didn't answer. I didn't owe them an explanation. The court had already given them one. Instead, I wrote a letter, short, direct. I said I loved my son, but trust had been damaged, that any future relationship would require time, accountability, and professional mediation. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer money. I offered a path. Whether they took it was no longer my responsibility. Sealing that envelope felt heavier than any check I'd ever written. People often ask if I regret not settling. The answer surprises them. Regret implies doubt. I don't doubt my decision. What I regret is that it came to this at all. But regret doesn't rewrite history. It informs boundaries. I began volunteering again, mentoring young tradesmen entering the industry. I told them about contracts, about planning, about living within their means. I never mentioned my son. The lessons didn't need a case study. Meanwhile, life simplified. Mornings were quieter. Sleep came easier. I realized how much background stress I'd been carrying, anticipating requests, bracing for disappointment. That weight was gone, and with it went the version of me that mistook sacrifice for love. 6 months after the verdict, my son finally showed up at my door. No warning, no anger, just him. He looked older, not wiser, just worn. He didn't come inside. He apologized. Not the polished kind, the messy kind. He said he let resentment turn into entitlement. He said he listened to the wrong voices. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I told him I accepted the apology, but trust wasn't automatic. He nodded like he expected that answer. We stood there in silence. Then he left. I didn't know if that was an ending or a beginning, but I knew one thing. It would happen on honest terms or not at all. In the months that followed, I heard less and less about them. That told me enough. Stability doesn't announce itself. Chaos does. I returned to routines I'd neglected. Early walks, woodworking projects, long lunches with old friends. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped anticipating conflict. The lawsuit had taken something from me, but it had also given me clarity. I no longer confused obligation with love. That distinction changed everything. One evening, I found the original lawsuit documents tucked in a drawer. I almost threw them away. Instead, I kept them, not as a reminder of pain, but of resolve. Boundaries are invisible until someone tries to cross them. Then they become everything. I learned that standing firm doesn't make you cold, it makes you clear. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my son. Rebuilding trust is slow work, and it requires humility on both sides. But I know this: I will never again trade my peace for someone else's comfort. That lesson cost me more than money, but it paid me back in freedom. When people hear my story, they focus on the lawsuit. I focus on the moment before it, the calm no, because that's where everything truly changed. Saying no didn't break my family, it revealed it. And sometimes revelation is the only way forward. Time has a way of settling truths that arguments never can. Nearly a year passed after my son stood on my porch, apology hanging between us like unfinished business. We spoke occasionally after that, short calls, neutral topics, careful tones. There were no demands anymore, no accusations, just distance. And strangely, that distance felt healthier than the closeness we once had, built on expectation instead of respect. I learned that reconciliation doesn't start with forgiveness, it starts with changed behavior. I watched closely. I listened more than I spoke. Every interaction felt like testing thin ice. Still, something inside me remained steady. I was no longer afraid of losing the relationship because I had already survived its collapse. That realization gave me patience, and patience, I learned, is power when you've stopped needing control. I also noticed something else during that year. How many people quietly live under financial pressure from family? Friends began opening up once they heard my story. Parents funding adult lifestyles, siblings expected to rescue bad decisions, guilt disguised as loyalty. I never offered advice unless asked. When I did, I kept it simple. Love shouldn't bankrupt you, emotionally or financially. Some nodded, some went quiet. Truth lands differently depending on where it hits. I realized my story wasn't unique, it was just visible, and visibility makes people uncomfortable because it removes excuses. One afternoon, my son asked if we could meet for coffee. Public place, neutral ground. That mattered. He arrived early, paid for his own drink. Small things, but meaningful ones. He told me they'd sold the house, downsized, adjusted their lifestyle. He didn't blame anyone. That, more than anything, told me growth had begun. I didn't congratulate him. I acknowledged the effort. There's a difference. We talked for an hour about work, about responsibility, about how quickly resentment can turn into justification. When we stood to leave, he didn't ask for anything, and for the first time in a long while, I believed him. Still, rebuilding trust isn't a straight line. There were moments I caught myself bracing for manipulation that never came. Trauma teaches reflexes. Healing teaches restraint. I reminded myself that forgiveness is not forgetting, and reconciliation is not obligation. We moved slowly. Holidays were separate, calls were brief. Progress was quiet. That suited me. I had learned that loud resolutions often hide unresolved motives. Quiet consistency doesn't. Looking back, the lawsuit forced me to confront something deeper than betrayal. It forced me to redefine my identity outside of fatherhood. For years, I had measured my worth by how much I could provide. When that role was challenged, I panicked, not because I was wrong, but because I didn't know who I was without it. The trial stripped that illusion away. I wasn't valuable because I paid. I was valuable because I stood firm. That distinction reshaped how I moved through the world. I started saying no more often, to requests, to expectations, to roles that didn't fit anymore. And the world didn't collapse. In fact, it simplified. People who respected boundaries stayed. People who benefited from my lack of them drifted away. That sorting process felt ruthless at first. Then it felt relieving. Peace, I learned, is selective. Every once in a while, someone asks if I'd ever help my son financially again. The answer is honest, not dramatic. If there were genuine need and mutual respect, maybe. But never without clarity, never without accountability, never at the cost of my stability. That's not punishment, that's wisdom earned the hard way. I keep the house now exactly how I like it. Quiet mornings, open windows. No waiting for the next request, no calculating emotional debts. Freedom isn't loud, it's subtle, and once you feel it, you protect it instinctively. The lawsuit ended on paper long ago, but its lesson stays active. Family love isn't proven by sacrifice alone, it's proven by respect, especially when money is involved. Without respect, help becomes leverage, and leverage poisons everything it touches. My son sued me for $600,000 and lost. But the real loss wasn't the case, it was the illusion that love can be enforced. What we're rebuilding now is slower, quieter, and more honest than anything we had before. And this time, it's built on truth, not obligation. Some battles don't make you richer, they make you free.